the propaganda of China and Russia and other BRICS countries and the global South. I mean, they all describe the war in Ukraine as the opening front of World War III. And if you listen carefully to the sort of the neocon wing in Washington, this is all just stepping stones towards the ultimate prize, which is, in their mind at least, which is China, which seems insane to say. But to the Russians and to the Chinese and to the global South, there is a worldwide war. On one side of that war is the sort of Western alliance, the anchor members of the US dollar financial system, and then there's the BRICS countries basically on the other side. And you could almost view this as a global war for US dollar supremacy.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the WTFinance podcast. On this episode, I have the pleasure of welcoming back a very popular guest, Doomberg. So Doomberg, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
Anthony, always great to chat with you. Looking forward to another one.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to it. And I think, this last 6 months since we last spoke, it seems like a lot has been happening. So I'm sure we'll have many different places to touch on. But yeah, as always, I like to start very broad. So what are you currently seeing in the markets and the economy and geopolitically?
Well, sure. I mean, the big question of the day is the war in the Middle East and whether the ceasefire holds. The consequences of that war, which are still playing out, I think it'll actually reverberate for years, even without any further escalation. And so I think we saw, the geopolitical price risk embed itself into the energy markets, in particular for oil and liquefied natural gas. And then when the theater of last weekend transpired, then everything is sort of back to pre-war price levels. And so the market kind of took this all in stride, but there are pretty substantial second and third order long-term consequences, we think, coming down.
Yeah, interesting. You said that you don't think this has ended. So what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the war may have ended, but the consequences of the war still need to play out. So, attacking nuclear facilities, it kind of throws into question the non-proliferation treaty. I think if you read, if you spend some time reading outside of the Western media, you see that the rest of the world is quite shocked by these events and quite concerned about the proliferation of nuclear weapons and how instead of diminishing the prospects of such proliferation, the Israeli strike on Iran and then the US strike on Iranian nuclear sites will only accelerate it. Former Russian President Medvedev was on Twitter saying as much, which concerned Trump enough that he actually replied to it. So North Korea probably shopping around their weapons. Pakistan, if you're a country today that might one day be in the crosshairs of U.S. Foreign adventures, you're taking a look at what's happening to Iran and what's not happening to North Korea and deciding between the two, aren't you? So we shall see. It's never quite as simple as it's portrayed in the media, and we think the 12-day war, as it's now being called, will be viewed by historians as a rather substantial event.
Yeah, it's a great point because, as you say, it's people. You can be attacked unless you have a nuclear weapon, and I don't think anyone would ever hopefully attack another country with nuclear weapons. You hope not, but it seems like that's what a lot of these dictators and people are going to be trying to aim for, to protect their own rule of power.
Yeah, and then where do we go from here? Remains to be seen, of course. This, of course, is why the long-range missile attacks into old Russia or deep inside Russia were so dangerous at the end of the Biden administration, because Russia is not just a nuclear power, but it's the world's largest and arguably most sophisticated nuclear power, which makes the whole NATO, Ukraine, Russia war all the more dangerous. And so if we're going to normalize attacking nuclear sites in the same way that the world has normalized attacking the wanton destruction, really, of mostly civilian energy infrastructure, that we're just crossing many, many red lines, unthinkable red lines just a decade ago. And our view and our wish is that Western leaders would give a bit more thought to the second and third order consequences of their actions.
Yeah, that seems to be the challenge. It seems to go back, if you go 30 years to Serbia and sort of the NATO intervention there, which, could say it's the right thing. But then if it's going against the UN, it's sort of, if the West and the US do it for the right reasons, and other people will use that excuse for the wrong reasons, same as sort of the Middle East conflict in the early 2000s. Yeah.
The United Nations Security Council is utterly irrelevant today. It's a talking body. There were internationally, applicable ways to go about preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. One can argue that those ways weren't working, but there's even a mechanism to address that. And by circumventing international law, and I don't think it's questionable, whether or not it's justified. Again, we're not making a judgment on the decision. We're certainly not in possession of all of the intelligence that, say, the Israelis were before they decided to go. But nonetheless, it's just undeniable that nobody's going to pay attention to the UN Security Council anymore, and arguably that's probably in aggregate a bad thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I know you mentioned that, I think in another interview with David Lynn, potentially, that you could see it's sort of these conflicts are basically, I don't know if they're leading to World War III or they're sort of a part of this larger global outburst of violence. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have sort of begun to call the Israel-Iran war the second phase of World War III. If you read the propaganda of China and Russia and other BRICS countries and the global South, I mean, they all describe the war in Ukraine as the opening front of World War III. And if you listen carefully to the sort of the neocon wing in Washington, this is all just stepping stones towards the ultimate prize, which is, in their mind at least, which is China, which seems insane to say. But to the Russians and to the Chinese and to the global South, there is a worldwide war. On one side of that war is the sort of Western alliance, the anchor members of the US dollar financial system, and then there's the BRICS countries basically on the other side. And you could almost view this as a global war for US dollar supremacy. And I think in 20, 30 years, that's how historians will describe the period from 2022 until whenever the hostilities subside, should they ever.
Yeah, and it makes you think, obviously, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and I guess Taiwan, you'd imagine, is the major breaking point that hopefully doesn't happen, but you can see it's high risk.
And it's amazing. But by the way, the most amazing part is the people who are strongly pro-war, like the Lindsey Grahams of the world and the John Boltons of the world. They actually think the U.S. could defeat China in a kinetic conflict. It's literally insane. NATO is basically defeated by Russia, and so the same crowd supported Israel's strike against Iran. We have a view of why a ceasefire was desperately needed. That is not the mainstream view, but we've articulated it in a couple of pieces. And yet, despite these setbacks, all of the talk is China's next. I mean, it's pretty amazing. We note with interest that the U.S. Congress has not declared war since World War II. And basically, the U.S. hasn't won a war since World War II. Not sure why the U.S. keeps getting into these wars, let alone thinking they can win them. So yes, the U.S. is a very substantial military superpower. It can project force all over the world in ways that no other country can, but that's a whole different ball of wax than defeating Russia or defeating China or their combination of them, backstopped by Iran and North Korea, which is exactly what's going on today in a kinetic conflict. It's really crazy, especially in light of the fact that the U.S. has outsourced much of its military supply chains to China. But nonetheless, as analysts, our job is to predict what's happening or understand what's happening, and it seems like the next stop on the war train is going to be China.
Yeah, which is crazy to think. And I think the challenge is, I guess, you could say that the West have provided sort of what they can provide to Ukraine. So they haven't really gone all out into an all-out war against Russia. So I imagine that it would have been very different if that were the case.
Well,
Not that it's possible, probably, with nuclear weapons.
Well, that's the point, right? China is a
Yeah.
nuclear superpower as well. And Russia has not gone full out in its war in Ukraine either. Um, it has not converted its economy into a war economy. It's not doing, it's not bringing as many soldiers into the military as it could. So who's to say? Who? Thank God we won't. Doesn't look like we'll find out what would happen if the U.S. shipped over 500,000 troops and went to war with Russia. It would be bloody, but that looks like we're not going to find that out. But I don't understand. At least like in a theoretical war with Russia, you have Western Europe as a base. Where are you going to put the American soldiers? They're going to occupy China. I don't know. It's just crazy talk, but it's out there.
Yeah, I think that would be the most impossible part, the logistics of it all, and especially under with such a big war. Yeah, it would be bigger than anything that's
and with nuclear weapons. Like,
yeah,
you don't get into kinetic wars with nuclear superpowers. But nonetheless, there'll be some kind of skirmish. Missiles will fly, bomb stocks will be depleted, military-industrial complex will get paid, and hopefully life goes on.
Yeah, it's hope. And how do you? I don't know if you sort of have looked at different scenarios of. You mentioned the next 30 years, potentially the de-dollarisation of the world, and then I guess there's going to be a shift in global power, or do you see it more being sort of these different, I guess, areas? It's going to be the East and the West. How do you see that?
Yeah, we're putting out a Pro Talk presentation, our Doom Zoom for June, called Goldileo, the yellow rock at the center of our financial universe. We think all roads lead to gold. In the US dollar system, if treasuries are no longer neutral, then they can't serve as neutral reserve assets for the settlement of imbalances in international trade. And you're seeing already that gold is now number 2 in the leaderboard of reserves held by central banks and climbing. The euro has slipped to 3. And so ultimately, in a bifurcated world where the Western Alliance members still trade predominantly in US dollars and hold treasuries as reserve assets, and then the BRICS countries create their own system, and they'll be trading at the interface. But we think gold, which is a neutral reserve, can't be seized if you're in physical possession of it, for example, in the way that the Russian reserve assets were seized. Gold can only rise in importance from here as a consequence of it.
Okay, interesting. And you don't think the West will go that route? They'll sort of go the current route they're doing at the moment?
Well, I mean, I don't think that Western Europe and Japan and South Korea are going to, go full steam ahead and de-dollarize. No, but Iran and China and all the countries that the U.S. and the Europeans have sanctioned are going to be forced out of necessity to create their own system, and they're doing it very busily. And sanctions don't work, which is a common theme of our writing. They backfire, and the aggressive use of sanctions against China and its semiconductors is only going to accelerate Chinese semiconductor development, in the same way that sanctioning Russian oil was only going to strengthen Russia. Sanctions don't work; they backfire, and yet, like going to war and losing all of them, Western politicians seem to treat every piece of evidence of ineffectiveness as proof of the need to do more.
But yeah, it's the same with European integration. It's just that we need to integrate more. It's the same with I guess the social aspects in the UK and Europe as well. We just need to give more. We need to tax people more. It's just trying to go further and further into the things that haven't worked for the past.
Yeah, look, we think the EU would have been a victim. The EU itself, the entire project, would have been a victim of a closure of the Straits of Hormuz, for example. The fact that Europe doesn't produce any of its own hydrocarbons really would have left them completely exposed to an every country for itself fallout from the closure of that strait. Again, luckily, it looks like it didn't happen. And we wake up this morning and we see Moldova's on a fast track to join the EU, and so we'll see. At the same time, we're starting to see sort of fraying at the edges of the EU. Obviously, Hungary and Serbia and the countries that are dependent on Russian natural gas aren't super happy with the Brussels strategy with regards to energy. But like you say, every struggle of the EU, every crisis just tightens the grip of Brussels and is used as an excuse to do more.
Yeah, definitely. So, do you think it would have been possible for Iran to sort of close the Strait of Hormuz? Because I know there's lots of thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, people think that the only way to close the strait is to sort of direct use of military, but there are all kinds of ways to convince insurance companies not to underwrite the passage, and you don't have to mine the strait in order to do that. Fire enough missiles. Look at how the Houthis have done it. It's not as difficult as people are portraying it. And we argued that it was a choice not to on the part of Iran, probably at the coaxing or the strong suggestion of China, who depends on that strait more than any other country. So it wouldn't be as hard to do sort of tactically, but the strategic decision to do it is probably far more challenging.
Yeah, and as you're saying, it would have affected, obviously Europe would have been greatly affected, but more, I think, China, obviously Qatar and UAE, which I think Iran's, at least Qatar reasonably friendly with, so would have actually affected more people, the countries that they're friendly with rather than the others.
Sure, yeah. And now look, as a result of this conflict and the ceasefire, so we believe that the ceasefire was necessary because Israel was running out of air defense missiles. And much of the actual event has been severely censored in the West. And you have to go to primary sources in other countries to get a sense of what was going on. But you can be sure that China and Russia are going to be rearming Iran at a rate that is faster than the US and its Western allies can resupply Israel. And so this is why we think the oil markets have behaved in the way that they have, because they view it as unlikely that Israel will be in a position to strike Iran further, and that China and Russia will be able to restrain Iran from striking Israel. We'll see. Trump's talking about meeting with the Iranians next week, I suppose, he said, but who knows? But that's why oil is where it is, and that's why the war had to end when it did, in our view.
Yeah, the oil markets have been amazing. I think since Liberation Day, I was looking at a chart the other day and it just went, straight down, and obviously the Middle East straight up, and now the ceasefire straight down.
Well, the oil markets, this was very instructive for us. We developed this theory. So, when Trump announced the devastating strike, as he would frame it, on Iran, that night, Saturday evening, we posted to Notes, the Substack's version of Twitter, that this all seemed rather performative. And in talking to oil experts during the day on Sunday, we came to the conclusion and advised a few friends who participate in such markets that they needed to sell the open on Sunday because it was clear that this was going to be over. And there's a fascinating article in the Financial Times describing how the oil traders got it right. And one of our big, we took away several lessons from this whole affair. The first being that people who are steeped in propaganda are very incapable of recognizing it. Two, open source still works, and you can discover something closer to the truth if you're willing to put in the time to separate signal from noise on social media predominantly. You could, with just Telegram and Twitter, you could figure out with pretty good accuracy as to what was going on. And then the third is the oil markets are just incredibly efficient. And literally the moment that it was announced that Iran was striking the military base, that's when the oil prices collapsed, because as one of the traders who was quoted in this Financial Times article correctly said, like they knew that this was choreographed. And you saw immediately after that, Trump's Truth Social post about a ceasefire, and then the whole amazing, really staggeringly amazing posts about Israel's bombing run and don't drop those bombs and the use of vulgarity in front of the press. It was really just a remarkable 24 hours, just incredible to watch.
Yeah, interesting. I know, and it's probably similar to what you're saying there, that it sounds like the actual physical markets hasn't been a problem. It's sort of probably oversupplied, but it's all the sort of the paper markets which has really been massively impacting the volatility.
You can't have the potential for a closure of the strait not be reflected in a risk premium. And on the David Lynn interview, which came out the day, we recorded that interview a couple hours before the ceasefire, and I believe on that interview I predicted there would be a ceasefire within a week. We estimated that the equilibrium price of oil is $55 a barrel, and oil was trading around 78 at the time that we recorded that, I believe, or maybe a little less than that, but there was about $20 worth of geopolitical risk premium in the market, which feels about right, because the closure of the strait would have caused oil prices to skyrocket into the triple digits, at least temporarily. And so you have to sort of game the risk. That's what markets do. But the moment Iran announced its strike on the U.S. military base at Qatar, it only took minutes for the oil markets to figure out what was going on and to price it appropriately. And oil prices are now, as we record this, below where they were when Israel first attacked. We believe that attack was kind of sniffed out by the oil markets. And so when oil returns to 60, if it does, then you'll know that the full risk event has played itself out.
Okay, and do you see 60 being like a bit of a base, or do you think it could even potentially go further?
Our equilibrium price is $55 a barrel, and I can explain how we arrive at that. $10 per million BTU landed LNG is the sort of base price that the natural gas market needs for everyone in the chain to make money, earn their cost of capital. And $10 a million BTU landed LNG is about $56 a barrel oil. And so since they are produced together, gas and oil, and they are fungible in enough applications that they can be switched, that is sort of the anchor equilibrium price. So a couple of the charts that we follow, one is the spread between WTI and Brent, which, as we predicted in our article, would have blown out if the strait had been closed, but also the plot of landed LNG against Brent crude, where you take the price of LNG and multiply it by 5.6 to put it in oil terms. And those two have been trading in lockstep, which is another sign that the markets are pretty well balanced and well behaved. And so 55 is our equilibrium price. Of course, supply demand fluctuations, paper moves, who knows, can swing it around that price, but that is an anchor for our analysis based on the methodology that I just described for you.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess, as you said, sort of similar break-even prices for a lot of the fracking in the US, and so that's probably
that's an interesting question. What is the break-even price of natural gas or oil when they're co-produced together? And so people talk about the break-even price of oil in the Permian, not pondering that if natural gas prices got high because, let's say, AI demand kicks in, oil could become the commodity that producers in the Permian can't give away. And that's entirely possible because natural gas has attributes that oil doesn't. And in a world where natural gas is the fuel that powers AI, you could see oil prices substantially depressed because people are drilling for natural gas and getting oil as a consequence. Half of the U.S. crude is co-produced with natural gas today.
Yeah, it's a great point. And with all the LNG sort of terminals coming online in
sure,
Gulf of, that's sort of, it seems like there's the market's becoming more efficient. It's going to become potentially a global gas market.
Forever thus. Markets don't get less efficient as over time, unless, of course, you have wars, which would have bifurcated markets and caused regional price spikes, the likes of which we have never seen. But all things being equal, in a time of peace, arbitrage grinds its way over the short, medium, and long term.
Okay, great. And do you see this being sort of a bit of a longer term trend? So, because I know lots of people are saying, especially, yeah, there's lots of gas and LNG facilities coming online in the coming years, potentially oil as well. There's actually quite a lot of non-OPEC oil coming online in the coming years.
Yeah, lots of mega trends in the energy space. The trend towards lighter molecules, natural gas liquids. The lightest of the molecules is natural gas itself. For modeling purposes, we like to say that there's an infinite supply of natural gas. And as the world gets better at handling and moving natural gas around, it will gain more and more share. The new statistical review of world energy just dropped today, which is kind of like Christmas in June for us. I'm going to dig through that and see the trends and see how 2024 played into those trends. But if everybody could get natural gas, it'd be the fuel they would burn. It's the cleanest, and in many ways, oil is unique in its own ways. That mostly because we have the engines tuned to burn gasoline and diesel and jet fuel because oil was available. The long-term trend, of course, is we'll just switch the engines and we'll all burn natural gas. There's just so much of it, and it's so cheap. The break-even price for natural gas drillers in U.S. shale, like for dry gas, is $250 a million BTU. That's $12 a barrel oil. It's just cheap, clean, and abundant, and so people will use it more and more over time.
Yeah, really interesting. And do you see those sort of states, I guess, especially in the US, going to benefit greatly from having that very cheap energy with this AI revolution and with the need for basically cheap energy to be efficient?
Sure, not just the US, but Russia. Russia has an enormous amount of natural gas. A lot of it is in the Arctic. And we're writing a piece right now, tentatively titled Plenty to Spare. We'll see if the editor-in-chief can't come up with a better name than that. But Russia has an enormous amount of natural gas, and with Europe shunning Russian natural gas, it's got to go somewhere. And one of the places it might go is into data centers and AI that the Russian military and the Chinese military might collaborate on and build them out in the Arctic. Half of the energy consumed in a data center in the US is used towards cooling. A lot simpler task to cool an AI data center in the Arctic, you would think. And so, these molecules have a way of coming to market. Another thing that we're going to talk about in this piece is how the war in the Middle East might spur China to finally agree on terms with Russia to build the Power Siberia 2 pipeline, which will permanently redirect gas molecules that had been flowing to Europe south to China. Again, the bifurcation of the energy world, as well as the financial world, keeps going apace.
Yeah, definitely. It's always the way. So, Doomberg, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. We sort of touched on so much. But my last question is, what is one message you want people to take away from the conversation?
One message from the conversation is that war is a racket and should be avoided. But realities are such that war seems to be omnipresent, and that's rather unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. And so you have to invest and plan and strategize accordingly.
Yeah, great message. So thanks again. If anyone wants to find out more about your work and what you do, where was the best place for that?
Yeah, just Doomberg.com, one-stop shop for all of our articles. We have a pro tier subscription as well that gets you a monthly webinar, like the gold one that we're going to be putting out probably on Monday. All of our podcasts are there, like this one. And then we also have a merchandise store that we haven't fully launched yet, but Doomberg.myshopify.com. We have some pretty high quality product. We've finally been able to get hats and t-shirts and golf balls and Yeti mugs of a sufficient quality and the ability to serve our customers consistent with our brand. So anybody wants to check that out, that's just kind of fun and marketing, but people seem to enjoy that. So that's where you find everything, Doomberg.com or Doomberg.myshopify.com if you're interested in merch.
Great, perfect. I'll put this just below, but thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Anthony.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening. I really appreciate the support. If you've got value out of this, I'd really appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, or comment, you know, good or bad feedback. I'm always open to that. But it really helps with the channel. As I said before, only about 14% of people actually subscribe to this channel. So if you were to that, it would really help. It could mean we could continue to grow. If not, thanks for watching and see you on the next show. And you also might like this video right here. All right, thanks again.